Hello, everyone. It is with pleasure that I welcome you to the Year of Jacob of Serugh, an online series of lectures on the writings and theology of the Bishop of Batnan to celebrate the 1500th anniversary of his death. I am your host, Armando El-Khouri. I greet you from Washington, D.C. Robert Kitchen, the co-organizer, and I are glad that you could join us on Zoom today to celebrate Jacob. We also welcome our viewers on the YouTube channel of the Maronite Eparchy of Los Angeles and on the Facebook page Urho the Way. This talk is being recorded and will be posted online on the website thehiddenpearl.org. We thank our guest speaker, Aaron Butts, for his paper, A New Look at the Anti-Judaism of Jacob of Serugh. We extend our gratitude to Kelly Bryan Gibson for presenting our guest speaker, and His Excellency Elias Zaidan for sponsoring this online conference. Before we start, I would like to share with you the logistics of managing this talk. You may direct your questions to today's speaker only at the end of his presentation. To do so, click on the reactions icon under the video feed. When the small pop-up window opens, click on Raise Hand. I will call on you in the order I see on my screen, and I will request that you unmute yourself. Once unmuted, you may ask your question. To celebrate the achievements of researchers in Syriac studies, we have invited James Walters to present his forthcoming book, Eastern Christianity, a Reader, which will appear in November. Before that, however, Robert Kitchen is going to acknowledge the election of the new Assyrian Catholicos, Mar Awa III. I thank all of you for joining us. Robert, the mic is yours.
Has been our custom on this Jacob of Serugh series, we've wanted to make known and acknowledge events in the Syriac family. And just on, well, it was last week, but also this Monday, that the 122nd Catholicos Patriarch of the Holy, it's the Holy Apostolic Church, Holy Apostolic Catholic Assyrian Church of the East, has been selected and ordained. And that is someone many of us have known, Mar Awa Royal, the Bishop of California. He has taken the name Mar Awa III, and so we congratulate him. Condolences as well for the weight of the position, but we look forward to good things ecumenically in his work. So congratulations again to Mar Awa III.
Hello, I'm James Walters. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Armando and Bob for this kind invitation to take just a minute to share about this forthcoming work. And I also want to thank Aaron for generously giving a few minutes of his presentation time. I promise not to take too much of it. So I'm going to share my screen just to show you some slides so that you don't have to look at my face. So I'm going to be introducing a new resource for studying and teaching Eastern Christian traditions. The book is called Eastern Christianity, a Reader, and it will be published by Eerdmans, presumably in November, as Armando mentioned. I haven't heard anything contrawise, but the plan was to have it out before AAR-SBL in November. Who knows if that meeting will actually take place in person this year again, but that's the goal, is to have it out in time. So the volume will include English translations of Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, Arabic, Coptic, and Ethiopic Christian texts from late antiquity all the way up to the early modern period. Let me just say something about the title and the particular selection of languages. I wanted to give it a broad title that would bring all of these languages into sort of a bigger umbrella of Eastern Christianity, rather than sort of cordoning them off as Oriental Orthodox or some sort of subset of Eastern Christianity, but rather to bring these texts and these authors more into the mainstream consciousness of what it means to talk about Eastern Christianity more broadly. And we didn't exclude any particular languages for any particular reason. One of the biggest things you might say is missing from a collection of Eastern Christian texts is there's no Greek text here. So we didn't exclude Greek on purpose. The idea was there's plenty of resources for Greek texts out in the world, although more could be published, of course. But these languages are not as well known, even among historians of Christianity. So the goal was to create a resource for teachers to give access to texts, because that's one of the main problems when people want to know more about these other traditions of Eastern Christianity. The texts simply are not as widely available. So this book is meant to give one small step in the right direction of bringing these texts into a more mainstream audience. So each chapter, it's divided by languages. So each chapter includes a general introduction to that language and the literature, and then also gives a general bibliography for each language. I'll just quickly put up slides of all of the contents of each language. I'm not going to read every single title because that would be boring to you, and that information is available online. So if you just go to eerdmans.com and find the volume, you can see the table of contents listed. So you can see there's a series of Syriac texts. I was responsible for kind of collecting the Syriac text section. So I farmed out a few translations to people who are working on interesting things. So I'll just highlight quickly, in addition to a few things translated by myself, Jeff Wicks, Aaron Walsh, who's also presented in this series this year, both of them, Jean-Nicole Melin-Saint-Laurent, and Aaron Butts, who is our speaker today. Jesse Arlen of UCLA has done the Armenian section. A lot of these translations, not every single one of them, but a lot of them have never appeared in English translation before. So that was another goal of the volume, was not just to repurpose things that have already been translated, but to bring new texts into translation. Particularly some of the poetry in this Armenian section, I find to be really moving and very interesting. The Georgian chapter was done by Jeff Childers. Now, you might think there's only 4 texts here. Why are there fewer texts here than in other chapters? But all of these 4 texts are pretty lengthy. So don't be put off by the number of texts. There's a lot of material here to read, translated by Jeff. The next chapter is Arabic, done by John Lamoureux. And I believe all of these texts are appearing for the first time in translation. Most of these are just excerpts. They're not the entire text, but John tried to pick some of the more interesting excerpts to translate and to include in the volume. The Coptic chapter was done by Mary Farag of Princeton Theological Seminary. And again, several of these have never appeared before in translation. One of the most interesting ones is a short letter by Christophoria. It's one of the few letters by a woman in Coptic that has survived from late antiquity. So that's an interesting title to highlight. And again, Aaron Butts did the Ethiopic chapter with some really fascinating selections for us to read, including some of the earliest evidence for Christianity in the Ethiopic tradition. So that gives you an overview of what is in each chapter. As I said, it should come out in November of this year. I, again, haven't heard anything otherwise, although I've heard that some printers are having problems getting things out on time because of paper shortages worldwide. So all that to say, it's supposed to be out in November, but I can't promise you that. But I can say it's available for pre-order at eerdmans.com and at Amazon, and I'm sure you could find it other places too. So With that, I'll close. Again, I'll say thank you to those of you who shared the time. And I look forward to Aaron's talk.
All right. Well, in the interest of hearing from the speaker more than we hear about him, I will keep my remarks short. Our speaker today is Aaron Butts, currently an associate professor at the Catholic University of America, and also director of that university's Institute of Christian Oriental Research. His research and teaching are focused on the languages, literatures, and history of Christianity in the Near East, especially Syriac, but Arabic and Ethiopic, as we've seen as well. He has published over 100 items, including 10 volumes and 30 peer-reviewed journal articles. His research has been supported by membership at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and by an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellowship for experienced researchers. Dr. Butts serves on numerous editorial boards, including those of Hugoye, the Journal for Syriac Studies, and the Journal of Semitic Studies, and he's the co-editor of Aramaic Studies, as well as its supplements series. And so I turn it over to Aaron Butts. The title of his paper is A New Look at the Anti-Judaism of Jacob of Serugh.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to share my screen with you. Before I begin my talk today, I'd like to thank Bob and Armando for inviting me to give a lecture in this series. I've never really thought of myself as someone who specializes in Jacob of Serugh, especially since there's so many more capable and qualified scholars who work more seriously on him, as I think this series is amply illustrated. So it truly is an honor to be among such esteemed company. In my lecture today, I want to discuss a somewhat difficult subject, and that is Christian anti-Judaism, especially as it occurs in Jacob. Anyone who spent much time with Jacob has encountered his anti-Judaism, which can be harsh and vitriolic. In 2009, while still a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I was translating Jacob's homily on the Tower of Babel. In the midst of his exegesis of the famous passages from Genesis 11, Jacob writes some 100 lines of harsh anti-Jewish polemic. This section makes up more than a fifth of the poem as a whole. Ever since that first sustained encounter, I've been thinking about anti-Judaism in Jacob, in the Syriac tradition, and in Christianity more broadly. Obviously, in one lecture, I can't lay out my entire thoughts on the matter. That'll take a book, and in fact, I've been working on such a book off and on for a number of years now. Today, however, I want to try to locate Jacob's anti-Judaism within the context of anti-Judaism during the Christological controversies. In particular, I'll focus today on cases in which Miaphysite Christians map theological adversaries onto Jews. That is, Miaphysite Syriac Christians describe the theological position of their adversaries as Jewish, and sometimes even label dyophysite and Chalcedonians as Jews. At the outset, I want to stress that my analysis, which focuses on this mapping, in no way aims to absolve Jacob of his anti-Judaism. That is, this project of mine is not intended to be some kind of cute and ultimately doomed attempt to suggest that since at least some of Jacob's anti-Judaism is directed against Christians and not Jews, Jacob's anti-Judaism is really not all that bad or something like that. Far from it, and quite the opposite, in fact. What I personally find so difficult is that Christian ideas about Judaism have historically, in many cases, have a greater impact on the conditions of life for Jews than anything Jews themselves might have done. So to state what I hope is obvious from the outset, anti-Judaism like Jacob's, regardless of its target, is harmful. So unfortunately, this paper won't be a hagiography. The paper is divided into two parts. The first sets the stage with a broader methodological and theoretical discussion, illustrated with some examples. In the second part, I home in on Jacob. So let me just dive in. The study of Christian anti-Jewish polemics has seen a revolution over the past quarter of a century. Following the publication of Simon's Veris Israel in 1948, scholars tended to see Christian anti-Jewish polemic as a reflection of a social reality in which Christians were in conflict with Jews. This conflict model, as it was termed by Taylor, interpreted rhetoric as proof of the existence of the other. Recent work has, however, been more cautious in positing a social reality based on polemical rhetoric. In particular, a number of scholars have argued that some Christian texts construct an imagined Jew for a variety of purposes, but perhaps most often to negotiate internal issues of identity. Thus, at least some Christian anti-Jewish polemic does not have a real Jew standing behind it. To give but one quote from Nirenberg's magisterial longue durée study of Christian anti-Judaism, discussing a passage from Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, Nirenberg writes, and I quote, "Eusebius's example reminds us that anti-Jewish logics were not necessarily, nor even primarily the product of confrontations between real Jews and followers of Jesus. Rather, they were often developed among Christians in their struggles with each other over which teachings to follow, and once teachings were cast into text, how they should be read. In other words, the logic of Jewish enmity in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries drew much of its nourishment not from Christian conflict with Jews, but from Christian conflict with other Christians." Given the recent passing of the esteemed Liz Clark, I would be remiss not to point out that this reconfiguration of the study of Christian anti-Jewish polemic is part of a larger trend in the study of early Christianity that has been dubbed the linguistic turn. As applied to the discipline of history, including history of Christianity, the linguistic turn questions whether the past, often conceptualized in the sense of von Ranke's "wie es eigentlich gewesen," as it actually happened, is recoverable. Instead, the object of study for the historian is textual representations of the past. There are many well-known consequences of this shift, but of primary interest to the topic of Christian anti-Jewish polemic is that the linguistic turn stresses the literary aspect of textual representations. Textual representations are no longer sources to be culled to discover what actually happened, as previous scholars would have maintained. Rather, they are literary productions that demand more nuanced reading strategies from us as scholars. As Clark enjoins, and I quote, "Christian writings from late antiquity should be read first and foremost as literary productions before they are read as sources of social data," end of quote. Scholars working on anti-Judaism and Syriac Christianity have unfortunately been slow to embrace this perspective. Consider, for instance, scholarship on the 4th century Syriac author Ephrem and his demonstrations. Among the 23 demonstrations, numbers 11 through 13 and 15 through 21 are framed explicitly as anti-Jewish. Given their relatively secure 4th century date and their probable composition in the Sasanian Empire, these demonstrations could, in theory, provide extremely valuable historical information about Jews in this region at this time. And it's with this goal that a number of previous scholars have approached the demonstrations. In a well-known book, Neusner used the demonstrations as evidence for the existence of a non-rabbinic group of Jews. More recently, in 2012, and so also in my view more problematically, Lazorkin has suggested that Ephrem was in dialogue with what he calls para-rabbinic Jews. Both of these scholars, as well as scores of others, have used Ephrem's polemical depiction of Jews as evidence for a particular form of Judaism different from that represented in the Babylonian Talmud. Each of these scholars has, however, failed to account for the literary nature of the demonstrations. What can the rhetoric of the text actually tell us about the other in this case? This question has traditionally been left unasked in studies of Syriac anti-Jewish polemic. Thankfully, there's indications that this is beginning to change. One of the first interventions was made by Shepherdson in a book from 2008, where she argued that anti-Jewish polemic in Ephrem's Hymns on Faith is best read as directed against Arians. I'm going to come back to this later in the paper.
In a more recent book, Gross and I have argued that the Syriac history of the slave of Christ constructs an imagined Jew based on the Hebrew Bible, and that therefore the text cannot be used as straightforward evidence for historical interactions between Jews and Christians, as previous scholars have done. Even more recently, I would point you to a volume that I co-edited, again with Gross, where we make an argument in the introduction for a more critical reading of Syriac anti-Jewish polemic. And some of the papers in the volume adopt this approach. In the case of Aphrahat, Walters argues in a contribution to this volume that the Jews in Aphrahat's demonstrations are a literary invention that helped to construct Christian identity. So this is pushing back against this earlier scholarship. All these contributions adopt a more nuanced reading of Syriac Christian anti-Jewish polemic that posits an imagined Jew who is engaged for a variety of internal purposes. In light of these studies and the theoretical work underlying them, I'd like to propose that one of the first questions that we should ask of Christian texts, including especially Syriac Christian texts in which Jews appear, is whether we're dealing with a real or imagined Jews. In some cases, the answer is relatively straightforward. First, I want to give you an example involving real Jews. This comes from the Book of the Laws of the Countries, which was probably written in Edessa in around 220. As this audience will already know, this text is concerned with the problem of fate and free will. Toward the end of the text, Bardaitzin adduces the Jews as an example of people who are spread throughout the world but follow the same laws. This is the passage on the slide. I'm not going to take the time to read it for you, but this is quite an extraordinary list of Jewish customs. And importantly, it's notably absent of any anti-Jewish polemic. One question among many that this text raises is, how does Bardaitzin know these practices? The law regarding circumcision could of course derive from the Bible, as does the law about worshiping idols. The same is true about several of the prohibitions on Shabbat, kindling fire, travel, buying and selling. But a number of the others cannot, including killing an animal, sitting as judge, participating in legal proceedings, tearing down and building. So, how does Bardaitzin know these Jewish practices that cannot derive from the Bible? In a recent paper, Cohen considered three possibilities. Bardaitzin learned them from the Jews of Edessa, from Philo, or from the Mishnah. Cohen argues convincingly, in my view, that it must be the first option. Bardaitzin learned these prohibitions about Shabbat from his own familiarity with Jews of Edessa. Thus, I'd propose here that we have a case of real Jews. I now want to look briefly at a case of imagined Jews. On the slide, you see an English translation of the Syriac letter of the Jews to Emperor Marci. As Ben Rompi has shown, this letter undoubtedly presents a literary construction of a Miaphysite author who opposes the Council of Chalcedon. The Jews in the letter ask that their transgression be forgiven, according to the letter, since it was decided at Chalcedon that God had not been crucified, but only a human had been crucified. Recall that from the Miaphysite perspective, Chalcedon decided that Christ was not fully God, and that therefore that God had not been crucified. This Miaphysite sentiment is placed in the mouth of Jews for reasons that will become clear in the course of this paper. But for now, I hope that you agree that it's obvious that we have imagined Jews in this passage. Both of these cases are, I think, relatively clear. Unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, it's not so obvious. What's more, I'm convinced that Syriac scholars have not been careful and critical enough readers of our texts containing anti-Jewish polemic. I want to illustrate this by looking in more detail at Syriac anti-Jewish polemic during the 5th and 6th centuries, and particularly cases in which Miaphysite Christians like Jacob of Serugh mapped their adversaries onto Jews. To set the stage, I begin with the letter on Bar Salma by Simeon of Beit Arsham. As indicated by its subtitle, the letter has two principal aims: to provide a genealogy of what he calls the heresy of the Nestorians, as well as to explain how it spread into the land of the Persians. Simeon traces the origins of dyophysite Christology to Jews. This is clear already in the first paragraph of the text, which you can see on the slide. Simeon then proceeds for the rest of the letter to explain how this, quote, Jewish opinion about Christ, end of quote, was transmitted from Hanan and Caiaphas to Simon Magus to Ebion to Paul of Samosata to Diodore of Tarsus to Theodore of Mopsuestia to Nestorius and so on. So Simeon's letter obviously links dyophysite Christology with Jews. Miaphysites, however, take this link one step further by mapping their adversaries onto Jews. Again, by mapping, I mean that Miaphysites represent their adversaries as if they are Jews. A few examples. The first example comes from the Miaphysite leader Severus of Antioch. Here on the left of the slide, you can see a door panel that at one time depicted Severus, which comes from the famous monastery of the Syrians in Egypt. In his first homily after being consecrated as patriarch, Severus assails the new Jews. I pick up mid-sentence. The madness of the new Jews. I'm speaking about those who gathered at the Synod of Chalcedon and divided the indivisible one into two natures. This homily, which happens to be preserved only in Coptic, was so popular that Severus apparently had to deliver it again 2 days later. My second example comes from the hagiography of the controversial 5th century bishop of Edessa, Rabula. Here on the slide, you can see an inscription from Rabula's lifetime that mentions him by name. The life of Rabula, which was written not too long after the bishop died in 435-6, tells of Rabula going to Constantinople to confute the ancient error of the new Jew Nestorius. One final example, this one from Jacob of Serugh, who's of course the reason that we're here today. As you know, Jacob's the author of a huge oeuvre, including more than 400 surviving homilies. From his own time until now, there's been heated debate about whether Jacob accepted the Council of Chalcedon or not. If you're interested in the topic, I'd point you to the insightful articles of Phil Fornes. Jacob's position on the council, however, became perfectly clear with the publication of his 43 surviving letters, as well as of his homily on the Council of Chalcedon, in which he clearly rejects the council. At the end of the paper, I want to return to the question of why Jacob's theological position is less clear than the other 400 surviving homilies by him. For now, however, I simply want to draw your attention to the following lines. O new Jews who have sprung up all of a sudden, why is it that the Church of the Son of God is torn in schism? These are just 3 of the many examples in which Miaphysites map their adversaries onto Jews. I chose these examples because they obviously involve mapping, since they include the adjective new in new Jew. Okay, so that brings me to the end of part 1, and I have a brief intermezzo for you before moving to part 2. So we're going to jump back in time a couple of centuries to the 4th century Trinitarian controversy so I can provide a little bit of background to the polemic. Christians have a long history of designating any doctrine that minimizes or negates the divinity of Christ as Jewish and its followers as Jews. I've gathered a large number of examples of this from Alexander of Alexandria to John Chrysostom, and all of this will be laid out in a chapter in the book form of this material. But for the sake of time, I only want to give you one example here, and that's Athanasius. Throughout his overtly anti-Arian works, Athanasius often compares his Arian adversaries to Jews. Consider, for instance, the example on the slide from his orations against the Arians. Note the echoes here with the later Syriac material that I cited earlier. The Arian heresy is Jewish and can be traced back to Caiaphas and Herod. And if Arians want to become Christians by rejecting Arius' madness, then they will also need to cease from the malevolence of the contemporary Jews, ton nun Judaeum. There are many additional examples in Athanasius I could cite for mapping Arians onto Jews, but I hope this will do for now. Athanasius is just one of many pro-Nicene Christians who mapped their Arian adversaries onto Jews during the 4th century Trinitarian controversies. In fact, this polemic is so robust that Lawrence wrote a book entitled Arius Judaicens, in which he investigated whether Arius and his followers were more likely to adhere to Jewish law. As I hope is obvious by now, the answer is no. Arius and his followers were in no way Jewish, or Judaizing for that matter. Rather, we're dealing here with a polemical strategy of pro-Nicene Christians. The very existence of Lawrence's study, however, shows the degree to which pro-Nicene Christians employed anti-Jewish polemic against their Arian adversaries. Before I leave the 4th century Trinitarian controversies, I want to point out that this same rhetoric is adopted by the great 4th century Syriac poet Ephrem. This has been studied in quite some detail in a book that I mentioned previously, Shepherdson's 2008 monograph, Anti-Judaism and Christian Orthodoxy, as well as several of our articles. So I just want to deal with it briefly here. First, I want to give you a macro example. Consider Ephrem's sermons on faith, which are preserved in the 6th century manuscript that you see on the slide. All 6 of the sermons in this collection are directed against Arian theology, and in particular Homoian theology. Yet in the middle of the 3rd sermon, anti-Jewish polemic suddenly pops up. The early translator Morris found this jarring, writing, "After a long digression upon the Jews, Ephrem returns to his old anti-Arian subject. But this digression is so long as to seem almost to have been fostered in here from some other homily." As Shepardson has already suggested, it seems much more likely that the anti-Jewish polemic in the 3rd sermon is actually directed against Arians. For those interested in evaluating your argument, I would point you to a new translation of Ephrem's Sermons on Faith by Andrew Hayes that recently appeared in the series Eastern Christian Texts and Translation. And as an aside, I'd like to mention that my co-editors, Robin Darling-Young and Sidney Griffith, and I would certainly welcome submissions to this series if you have translated texts. I now want to look at a more particular example from Ephrem's Hymns on Faith, which are preserved in 3 relatively early manuscripts, the earliest of which you can see on the slide. For this text, I point you to the English translation of Jeff Wicks, as well as his recent book on the topic. Like the Sermons on Faith, Ephrem's Hymns on Faith are directed against Arian theology, and again, particularly Homoian theology. The last hymn in the collection, number 87, takes up an extended comparison between the Jews at the time of Jesus' crucifixion and the present-day adversary, the Arians. I'll just give you one brief example on the slide. Instead of that reed which the first people gave to the Son, the later ones, who dared in their tracts, wrote with a reed that he, that is Jesus, is only human. The evil one exchanged reed for reed against our Savior. Here Ephrem evokes the gospel passages, especially Matthew 27, 29 through 30, in which Jesus is handed a reed and then beaten with this same reed. Note that in Matthew, as well as in Mark, it is Pilate's soldiers who do this heinous act, whereas Ephrem attributes it to the people, which is of course the typical way of referring to Jews in early Syriac texts. And here note that Ephrem uses not only people, but the first people. The adjective first is very important here. The action of the first people is contrasted with that of the later ones. That is, of course, the Arians, who use reeds to write that Christ is only a human. Thus, Ephrem's later ones is much the same as Athanasius's present Jews, or the new Jews we find in the Christological controversies. So in Athanasius and in Ephrem, as well as in scores of other 4th century authors, we see pro-Nicene Christians mapping their Arian adversaries onto Jews. Arians hold Jewish opinions about Christ. They suffer from the Jewish error that goes back to Caiaphas and Herod. They are Jews of the present, etc., etc. As is well known, the polemic of 4th century Trinitarian controversies is often re-employed in the Christological controversies. You can find a nice treatment of this in Davis's 2008 book, Coptic Christology in Practice. But basically, in the Christological controversies, authors of every Christological persuasion accuse their opponents of denying the divinity of Christ, just as Arius had done a century or two earlier. We see the same strategy, albeit much more narrowly, when Miaphysites accuse dyophysites of holding Jewish views of Christ. So that brings our intermezzo to a conclusion, and now we have to fast forward up to the Christological controversies about 2 centuries later. So far, I focused on cases in which the Miaphysite mapping is obvious, since they use the adjective new in new Jews. But now I want to push further. Given that Simeon of Beth Arsham links what he calls the Nestorian heresy directly with Jews, and given that other Miaphysite Christians, such as Severus of Antioch, the author of the Life of Rabula, and Jacob of Serugh, call their adversaries new Jews, I want to ask if it's at least possible that when Miaphysites are polemicizing against Jews without an adjective, that these Jews are actually a proxy for their Christian adversaries. So here I'm going to go where no previous scholar, especially in Syriac studies, has gone, so bear with me. I want to illustrate this argument with our Jacob of Serugh. We've already seen that in his homily on the Council of Chalcedon, Jacob refers to his adversaries as new Jews. Much more frequently, however, Jacob polemicizes against Jews without the qualifier new. I'd like to suggest here that at least some of Jacob's anti-Jewish polemic without the qualifier new may also refer to his Christian theological adversaries. So I'm going to begin with a couple of Christological examples. Jacob frequently intertwines anti-Jewish polemic with an insistence on the divinity of the Son. Such cases could, of course, be taken as polemic directed against his Christian theological adversaries. Consider, for instance, the passage on the slide. This comes from Jacob's homily on the Pentecost, which is otherwise not particularly anti-Jewish. This particular excerpt, however, includes a number of oft-employed anti-Jewish tropes. What might be slightly less obvious is that some of the language here also resembles how Jacob describes dyophysites in other places in his writings. For instance, polemic, divided, is often employed by Jacob against dyophysites, since it allows for the double entendre of divided in the sense of confused, but also those who divide Christ into two natures. Or consider the word durée, intoxicated, in the second line. Jacob often describes dyophysites as intoxicated. In his letter 14, for instance, Jacob makes a particularly pointed comparison between all the apostles who drink from one spirit, as per 1 Corinthians 12, and, quote, all those heretics who have become intoxicated from the poison of that first serpent, so as to divide the one only begotten of God into two. I could go on and on, but you see the point. Jacob uses some of this same language explicitly against dyophysites in other places in his writings. And then there are the final lines of this excerpt in which Jacob insists on the divinity of the Son. It's not difficult to see how this could be understood as anti-dyophysite polemic. I'll give you one more example, this time from Jacob's homilies against the Jews. In this passage, Jacob takes up the well-known analogy of the sun, light, and heat for the Trinity. What's important for us is how Jacob intertwines anti-Jewish polemic here with an insistence on the divinity of Christ. This collocation is found frequently throughout Jacob's writings. Given that Miaphysites often accuse their theological adversaries of negating the divinity of Christ, and given that in other places Miaphysites refer to these adversaries as new Jews, it seems possible, if not likely, that in such cases as the one on the slide, Jacob's anti-Jewish polemic is actually directed against dyophysites, even if he does not make it explicit with the adjective new. Before leaving Christology, I want to share with you a passage from just earlier in Jacob's homilies against the Jews. In this passage, Jacob is explaining how the birth of Eve from Adam is a type for the birth of Jesus from the Virgin Mary. This is where the quotation picks up. The status and veneration of Mary, of course, plays an outsized role in the Christological controversies. After all, it was Nestorius' refusal to use the appellation Theotokos, God-bearer, for Mary that provided the impetus for Cyril of Alexandria's sharp reaction, and so set into motion the events that would lead to Nestorius' eventual condemnation at the Council of Ephesus in 431. In the course of the debates over Theotokos, Christians often invoked the virginity of Mary in their polemic against Nestorius and his views. In fact, in his defense of Theotokos at the Council of Ephesus, Cyril highlights several times the marvel that Mary is both mother and virgin. Here we see very similar language in Jacob. Remember, this is in the context with Cyril of the anti-dyophysite polemic. Here it's in Jacob in the context of anti-Jewish polemic. I think that we really must consider that in passages such as this, Jew is actually a proxy for Jacob's dyophysite adversaries. That is, Jacob would be mapping the dyophysite onto Jews. Miaphysite Syriac Christians like Jacob, who would eventually become the Syriac Orthodox, were ardent followers of Cyril. Like Cyril, they developed a strong connection between Mary as Theotokos and an insistence on the unity of the divine and human natures in Christ. I think that this theology is nicely represented in the manuscript illumination you see on the slide. This, of course, comes from the famous Rabula Gospels, which likely stem from a 6th century Miaphysite provenance, with lots of asterisks. On the slide is an illumination of the Ascension. Note the prominent role given to Mary as Theotokos. She's arguably even the focal point of the illumination. This illustrates, I think, the close connection between Mary as Theotokos and the divinity of Christ, which was so important to Miaphysite Syriac Christians like Jacob of Serugh. I could spend the rest of my time discussing how Jacob uses anti-Jewish polemic against adversaries who, in his view, compromise the divinity of Christ. I, however, want to turn to a different area in which I think Jacob also maps his adversaries onto Jews, and that is biblical exegesis. Throughout his homilies, Jacob often criticizes what he calls pogranaya, or literal interpretation, preferring instead ruchanaya, or spiritual interpretation. Quite interestingly, this often coincides with anti-Jewish polemics. Again, this is a full chapter in the book, so I can only give you a taste of it here. My example comes from the Jacob's homily in the Tower of Babel, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, is what brought me to the topic in the first place. In particular, I'm interested in Jacob's discussion of the first person plural verb in Genesis 11:7. Come, let us descend. Jacob disputes that this phrase was directed to the cherubim, seraphim, or any other angelic beings, an interpretation which he attributes to Jews. He proposes instead that the first person plural let us signifies the kanoume, that is, the beings of the Son and Holy Spirit. This passage spans more than 100 lines, and as I already mentioned, is filled with anti-Jewish polemic. One of the reasons that I've chosen this example in particular is that the anti-Jewish polemic here could very well be directed against Jews, since it's known that at least some Jews did interpret the plural pronoun in Genesis 11:7 as referring to angels. You can see, for instance, the passage from Targos Pseudo-Jonathan on the slide. So it is possible that Jacob is directing his polemic against real Jews. As will, however, become clear shortly, I think that there's another, possibly even more likely, possibility. Jacob is arguing against how the passage was interpreted in the Antiochian exegetical tradition. To understand my argument, you'll need some context first. Already Ephrem in the 4th century interprets the first person plural verb in Genesis 11:7 as a reference to the Trinity. So Jacob's interpretation of Genesis 11:7 is not novel within the Syriac tradition. Rather, he's following in the footsteps of Ephrem, as he so often does. The interpretation of Genesis 11:7 as a reference to the Trinity is not, however, the only interpretation attested among Christians in late antiquity. As is well known, the Antiochian exegetical tradition tends to avoid Christological readings of the Hebrew Bible. Unfortunately, the exegesis of Genesis 11:7 by Theodore Mopsuestia, the most influential Antiochian exegete, does not survive to my knowledge. We do, however, have the exegesis of one early member of the Antiochian school, and this is Eusebius of Emesa, who died sometime before 359 and so was a rough contemporary of Ephrem. Eusebius of Emesa's exegesis of Genesis 11:7 is on the slide. As you can see, Eusebius gives two possible interpretations of the plural verb in Genesis 11:7. It could be the majestic plural, or God could be speaking to angels or other similar beings. Notably, Eusebius does not interpret Genesis 11:7 as a reference to the Trinity. Could this have been the standard interpretation of the verse in the Antiochian school? This is where the matter becomes interesting for Jacob of Serugh. Like his East Syriac contemporary Narsai, Jacob spent time in the school of Edessa in the 5th century. The school of Edessa was an important center for Antiochian theology, both Christology and biblical exegesis. And at the school, the works of Diodore of Tarsus and Theodore of Mopsuestia were translated from Greek into Syriac. This included, of course, many of Theodore's exegetical works. Though he studied at the school of Edessa, Jacob strongly rejected its Antiochian teachings. This comes out very clearly in one of Jacob's letters, number 14. In this letter, he anathematizes Diodore, Theodore, and all who follow their teachings. He goes so far as to describe them as having drank bitter vomit and as heretics drunk on the poison of the first serpent, as I mentioned earlier. So it's clear that Jacob was opposed to the school of Edessa and its Antiochian theology. Given this historical context, we can return to the question of who are the Jews in Jacob's polemic concerning Genesis 11:7. As is probably already clear to you, I think that Jacob's not arguing against real Jews here, at least not primarily, but rather against the Antiochian exegetes. Jacob could well have encountered a non-Trinitarian interpretation of Genesis 11:7 in the school of Edessa, and this could have been very similar to that of Eusebius of Emesa. Jacob rejects the non-Trinitarian interpretation in favor of his Trinitarian interpretation, such as that found already in Ephrem. The Antiochian interpretation is then denigrated by mapping it onto Jews. Before fleshing this argument out more, I want to provide one additional item of context, and that's Narsai. An interesting foil for my proposal is provided by Jacob's East Syriac contemporary Narsai. Narsai, like Jacob, studied at the school of Edessa, and in fact, Narsai and Jacob could have even have met there. Narsai would, of course, become one of the foundational figures of the Church of the East and serve as one of the main forces for the spread of Antiochian theology, both Christology and biblical exegesis among the Church of the East. More than 80 homilies attributed to Narsai survive, including a homily on the Tower of Babel. For those interested in Narsai, I just point you to the 2 volumes on the screen that recently appeared. Following in the footsteps of Ephrem, Narsai also interprets the plural verb in Genesis 11:7 as a reference to the Trinity. So Narsai and Jacob agree in their interpretation. But it's the way in which Narsai does this that's so telling. To give you a feel for the difference, I provided you with a number of lines from Narsai's homily on the screen. There's obviously a lot going on here, and I don't have time to analyze it all, but I want to make just a few points. Though Narsai's interpretation of the plural verb in Genesis 11:7 is the same as Jacob's, Narsai's treatment lacks all of the hostility and polemicizing of Jacob's. Jacob goes on for more than 100 lines about the interpretation of the phrase, "Come, let us descend." Narsai spends hardly more than 25. Jacob's language is also very harsh. Jacob rails against his Jewish opponents, calling them blind and deaf. None of this language is found in Narsai. In addition, and what's important for us here, Narsai makes no reference to the Jews, none at all. Interestingly, however, Narsai does mention the interpretation that Jacob attributes to the Jews. It occurs at the very end of the passage. Narsai writes, "Had he said, 'Go, descend, divide the tongue of man,' it would perhaps be likely that he called and sent spiritual ones." Narsai doesn't attribute this interpretation to the Jews. And note also how careful Narsai's language is in discussing the option. He doesn't dismiss it out of hand like Jacob. Rather, he makes an argument based on the use of the verb come instead of go. In addition, he says that this interpretation would have perhaps even been likely if a different verb of motion was used. Could this be a nod to the received Antiochian exegesis, as reflected in Eusebius of Emesa? I think that Narsai had 2 received interpretations before him when approaching Genesis 11:7. A Trinitarian interpretation from Ephrem, and a more historical reading from the Antiochian Fathers. He opted for the former and followed Ephrem. But he did not want to denigrate the Antiochian Fathers, whom he also held in high esteem. Jacob, in contrast, had every reason to vilify the Antiochian Fathers, and he did this, I propose, by mapping them onto Jews. This reading of Jacob can be further strengthened by looking at what exactly he says about his interpretation. About this interpretation. Jacob argues that Scripture, when interpreted correctly, shows that God has a son. Consider the passage on the slide. I'm particularly interested here in the last two lines, where Jacob shifts to the question of interpretation. The people have rejected that he has spoken about his beloved. The question of whether or not God has a son shifts to the question of whether or not God has spoken about him. That is, what's at issue with Jacob seems to be an exegetical question. How is the Bible to be read? Does it speak of God's son, or is it silent on the issue? Within the broader context of biblical interpretation in late antique Christianity, this can be read as an argument against the Antiochian method of exegesis, which tends not to see references to Christ in the Hebrew Bible. So in my reading of his homily on the Tower of Babel, Jacob is just as concerned with establishing how the Bible is to be read as with what it says. This can be further illustrated with the passage on the slide. And here you find my two crucial words, literal, pogranaya, and spiritual, ruchanaya. As I already mentioned, these words appear in a number of places in Jacob's homilies, and they often coincide with passages of anti-Jewish polemics. Based on Jacob's historical context, I'd like to propose to you that literal, pogranaya interpretation in Jacob might be a reference to Antiochian biblical exegesis, as represented primarily by Theodore Mopsuestia. In addition, and more to the point of my argument here, I think that Jacob mapped the Antiochian method of exegesis onto Jews. If you accept this argument, Jacob would join a sizable group of Christians who accused Antiochians of practicing, quote, Jewish exegesis, end of quote. Let us not forget that the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, as part of the 3 chapters, condemned the most representative of all Antiochian exegetes, Theodore Mopsuestia himself, for interpreting the Psalms in, quote, a Jewish fashion. So, just as he did in Christology, also here in biblical exegesis, I think that Jacob is mapping his Antiochian adversaries onto Jews. I want to conclude with some implications of this project. I'm convinced that each of the many Syriac texts in which Jews appear need to be analyzed anew, with an eye toward determining whether we are dealing with real or imagined Jews. Determining this is not, however, the end of the story, but only the beginning. For a number of questions follow once it has been established that we are dealing with an imagined Jew. Perhaps first among these is, who is the intended audience of the rhetoric? It could, of course, still be Jews. That is, Christians can construct an imagined Jew to combat real Jews, as Lieu has convincingly shown. But other, especially internal Christian targets are also possible and even likely. In this paper, I focused on cases in which Miaphysites directed anti-Jewish polemic against their theological adversaries. I've also discussed, albeit more briefly, Ephrem's anti-Jewish polemic, which at times seems to be directed against Arians, as Shepherdson has convincingly shown. What other internal Christian opponents are targeted with anti-Jewish polemic? In addition, external opponents are also possible. There are, for instance, a number of cases in which Christians employ anti-Jewish polemic against Muslims. In his letter 40, for instance, the Church of the East Catholicos Timothy I contrasts those old Jews from the days of Herod and Pilate with the new Jews among us, that is, of course, the Muslims. Gross and I have previously suggested a similar possible mapping in the Syriac history of the slave of Christ. But more broadly, I'm convinced that a thorough evaluation of Christian anti-Jewish polemic from the time of the conquest to at least the Abbasid period, with a view toward mapping onto Muslims, would be a worthwhile task. The approach for which I'm advocating here can, I think, provide new answers to long unanswered questions in the study of Syriac anti-Jewish polemic. To give but one example, it's long been asked why the anti-Jewish polemic of the Miaphysite Jacob is so much harsher than that of his dyophysite contemporary Narsai. The difference between Jacob and Narsai is, however, readily explainable, I think, once it's established that Miaphysites regularly employed anti-Jewish polemic against their dyophysite adversaries. On the one hand, some and even most of Jacob's anti-Jewish polemic may have actually been directed against dyophysite, as I've suggested here. On the other hand, Narsai would have had good reason to shy away from anti-Jewish polemic, since it was often directed against dyophysite like him. In addition, the approach for which I'm advocating here offers new insights into other questions in Syriac studies, not just those associated with anti-Jewish polemic. So if we return to Jacob, it's often asked why his homilies seem so divorced from the contentious theological debates of his lifetime. That is, apart from his homily on the Council of Chalcedon, which is explicit in its criticism, it's quite often difficult to tell what Jacob's stance actually is on the pressing Christological questions of his day. Bornes provides a number of insightful observations in his new and important book, Preaching Christology, that help to explain this conundrum. But here I want to add one additional suggestion. What if much of Jacob's anti-Jewish polemic is actually directed against his theological adversaries, the Diophysites and Chalcedonians? If so, all of a sudden Jacob's homilies fit their historical context shockingly well. We would have in Jacob a preacher who speaks directly about the theological issues of his day, through charged, even if frankly simplistic rhetoric that vilifies the other. Analyzing Syriac texts in this way can make a contribution to the broader history of Christianity as well. There is, after all, a sizable corpus of Syriac anti-Jewish polemic from various authors written over an extended period of time. And this can provide important comparanda for how to analyze Christian anti-Jewish polemic in other places at other times. In one chapter of the book version of this project, I investigate a very similar case of anti-Jewish polemic in medieval Ethiopian Christianity, in which there was a controversy over the veneration of Mary, in which anti-Jewish polemic is employed. Building on an insightful article by Sophia Dege-Mueller, I argue that this is an example of the Nachleben, or afterlife, of Christian anti-Judaism during the Christological controversies. In the end, I'm convinced that previous scholars have not taken sufficient account of how prevalent the Miaphysite mapping onto Jews actually is. The fuller picture that I've suggested here, and will do in much more detail in the related book, I hope sheds new light on 5th and 6th century Syriac Christianity, including especially an author like Jacob of Serugh. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Aaron, for this wonderful lecture. And as Susan would say if she were with us, this was a feast for all. To our participants on Zoom, you may now ask your questions. I kindly ask you to raise your virtual hand. And I would like to start with a question, if you don't mind, Aaron. Maybe you haven't done the research yet, but how would the audience of Jacob have received this message? Would they have understood what he was trying to say, or would have used it against actual Jews? If you can answer that question, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, of course, but my sense is that in its historical context, this type of mapping and polemic would make much more sense. So I mean, I'm thinking of like I don't know, you could think of like maybe a modern example. I hate to get too much into American politics, but you can think about casting around a label like communist in American politics, that in our current context, nobody, I hope not, thinks that we're talking about real literal communists here, but this rhetoric is used. So everybody who's kind of living now would understand it. But I guess my question is, I mean, what does it look like 1,500 years from now? And it, of course, would be a mistake to suggest that all of the anti-communist rhetoric in American politics in 2021 is directed against real communists, to use my scare quotes. So that's kind of how I see this playing out, that I think that it would be perfectly understood. And I want to be careful not to make, too much of a distinction, of course, that it can still be anti-Jewish polemic. I mean, and it could still be directed against Jews, but their purpose, I think Jacob's purposely kind of blurring the boundaries. That's how the mapping works between these two communities. So I think that they would understand what he was trying to say.
Okay, thank you. Ryan?
Hi, thank you very much, Professor Butts, and thank you once again to Armando and Malfono Kitchen. My question concerns a little bit of the context of, I guess, of West Syrian Christianity at that point. So we know earlier on, so St. John Chrysostom has many homilies against Christians who are adopting Jewish practices. And I was wondering if this trend was still present in the time of Jacob, and if they might be another category of people that Jacob was writing polemics against. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that's a great question. John Chrysostom's an interesting example because he's one of these people who featured quite predominantly in this reaction to Marcel Simon's Verus Israel book. That is, there were several books written soon after this Verus Israel book, arguing that we should take John Chrysostom's homilies, these so-called anti-Judaizing homilies, and this is proof that there are this kind of, either there's Jews or there's more likely this group of Christians who are adopting Jewish practices. And I think that this is another one that basically needs to be reevaluated. I mean, how do we move from John Chrysostom's anti-Jewish homilies to kind of what's going on the ground? So I mean, that's an honest question. I'm not a scholar of John Chrysostom, obviously, but I think that that's one that also needs to be asked. Most of this scholarship on anti-Judaism and John Chrysostom was done in the wake of Simon's work and hasn't really responded to this criticism so much. So that, but if I kind of push to your question more directly, the question becomes like, what's the evidence for Judaizing Christians in Syria, Mesopotamia in the 5th or 6th centuries? And there, I mean, you have Jewish polemic, of course, anti-Jewish polemic, but there's not much else. And it becomes very difficult to kind of tease out what's going on. One thing that I've kind of focused on in my own work is how much does any of this polemic seem to kind of correspond to what we know about Judaism more broadly or about practices more broadly? And what often seems to be going on, this anti-Jewish polemic, is drawing on the Bible. That is, it doesn't seem to know much about Judaism apart from the Bible. So this gives the sense that we're kind of in construction mode here and not reality mode. But yeah, I mean, what anti-Jewish Christian or what Judaizing Christians do we know of in 5th century Serugh? I mean, yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that's who Jacob's after. He's talking about whether the Son is actually divine and how to interpret the Bible. This seems to be much more of a ongoing dyophysite problem than having anything to do with some group of Christians who are Judaizing. But yeah, that's exactly the question, though. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan. Philip?
Thank you again, Professor Butts, for just a very full lecture, lots of great resources. It occurs that one of the mappings that's common is especially in the West, is the Pharisee, right? Like our Pharisees in the Reformation, right? It's a similar sort of thing. I'm wondering, does that more specific kind of mapping happen in, say, Syriac literature or just Eastern literature more broadly? So Jew it's a big word. I'm wondering if you know of like other examples of specifically biblical rhetoric, like scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, that kind of thing, showing up in a similar vein.
You get, I mean, maybe a good example would be Ephrem. You get a lot of this kind of scribes and Pharisees type of language. And this is one that Shepherdson's dealt with kind of extensively, and I think very well. But almost Shepardson argues, and I'm completely convinced that almost all of this language is just taken kind of straight out of the New Testament. So it's just this construction of a Jew who's basically the Pharisee of the New Testament. And this is, I mean, again, I want to be careful that, I mean, it's possible that you can construct a Jew in such a way and still be arguing against real Jews. That's totally possible. I think Lieu's perfectly demonstrated that, but it does raise the question of what's going on. So I think that you have a lot of constructions. Ephrem's the best example of, the New Testament Jew, scribe and Pharisee, this polemic being used in some way. And then the question is, is it used against real Jews or against Arians? And again, I think that she's pretty convincing that it's against Arians. No. Yeah, if I think you can continue if you want.
Yeah, so just that's really helpful. And I guess maybe I was wondering that, Pharisee is a term that doesn't really accord to any real person after a certain time, right? There are no more Pharisees actually, whereas Jew, there are, there's the possibility, and I'm wondering if maybe Pharisee would be a good term to.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, it's a good way to kind of sort some of this out. I mean, I haven't, like I said, I haven't been, I probably should look at Pharisees, it'd be a good idea, but I've been looking kind of at, Syriac depictions of Jews more broadly. And when you kind of get down and you start thinking about these things, if you really seriously ask this real versus imagined question, which I keep harping on, I think it becomes quite difficult to find real Jews. That there's just this text that I edited with Simcha Gross, The History of the Slave of Christ. It has Jews everywhere. They feature everywhere throughout the text. And it tells us all these practices about Jews, but none of them are things that we know to be about Jews. So that's the angle I've been taking. But the Pharisees would provide a control on it, since, as you mentioned, that there we know we're dealing with construction if we're in the 5th century, because there aren't Pharisees in that kind of way. So yeah.
Thank you, Philip. David?
Hi, Aaron.
Hello, David. I hope you have something sharply critical.
Yeah. I was going to say, great paper. Thank you very much. And I don't believe it for a minute. So, yeah, does he talk about new Jews sometimes? Yes, he clearly does. That's good. But the danger of just putting everything on that cart is it looks so much like another attempt, like Judaism, Christians, just to get away from the reality of this anti-Jewish polemic. The fact that the anti-Jewish polemic what's being said doesn't necessarily correspond to real Jews doesn't stop it from being anti-Jewish polemic. It just means it's not they're not interested in engaging with real Jews. My real problems with your arguments are when you use the passages that seem to be about the people or about Israel or about the Jews and argue that that's either anti-Chalcedonian or anti-Nestorian. There's several reasons that. One, you have to then go from, which I don't have a problem with in principle, Jacob is somebody, by and large, who doesn't seem aggressive towards other Christian groups, suddenly turning into a hyper-aggressive critic of other groups. But strangely, for a man who's never short of words, he never actually mentions them or states it or points the finger at them. He simply does it undercover, which seems to me deeply implausible. Another problem, I think, an area where you've got problems is that people who study Jacob's exegetical sources regularly draw on the fact that he's using precisely Antiochean exegetical themes himself. Mm-hmm. You say that, things like, well, the Antiochenes don't ever say that the Old Testament never talks about Jesus or Christ. But clearly, Theodore of Mopsuestia has several of the Psalms in which he says explicitly about Christ. Mm-hmm. So they avoid it, but they're not anti. So then you've got somebody who's drawing on the Antiochean tradition, and then you're having to argue that anything where he says this is a Jewish exegesis, this is anti-Antiochean. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are all sorts of points he might have disagreed on individual issues, but to say that all of those references are anti-Jewish, it seems to me, if you follow that line in your book, those chapters are going to get shot down. Whatever else you want to do is going to be as a kind of result of that. So those are some of my feeling is the guy's anti-Jewish. He's appalled by anyone that doesn't recognize Christ as being the Son of God. Mm-hmm. And that really drives this. They don't have to be real Jews. It's just this kind of concept. Mm-hmm. And the last point, sorry, just quickly, I'm just turning into a speech. You kind of had why is Narsai not anti-Jewish and Jacob is so anti-Jewish, and suggested that was because it was being used as a polemic against him. You could turn it the other way around and say, why is Narsai anti-women, for example, in a vicious, aggressive, anti-female sort of discourses, where someone like Ephrem isn't? And
looks like it goes.
You could try and come up with a sociological or historical context there, or you could just say the reaction, unfortunately, it is. Anyway, there's a series. I'm not sure, none of that's really a question, but it's a kind of a bit of a rant.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, I greatly appreciate it. Yeah, I want to state kind of upfront, yeah, that the difficulty with such a project is always that it tries to erase or change the anti-Judaism. And I want to be clear as I started that anti-Judaism is bad. And it's exactly, I mean, I think Nirenberg does maybe the best job of this in my view, but that pointing out that regardless of what this anti-Judaism, what the actual target of it is, anti-Judaism is a problem and has in some ways informed the West's response to Judaism more than what Jews themselves have done. I think that's kind of a quote from him. So I'm fully sympathetic, and I don't want the project to kind of ever be taken in that vein, and I understand the problem with it. I can, maybe in response, I can respond to two different things. The exegesis problem, I hear what you're saying, but I don't see how it at all kind of conflicts with what I'm arguing. That is, there's no doubt, I'm fully convinced that Jacob uses Antiochian exegesis all the time, that he was exposed to it, that he uses it all the time, on the one hand. I'm also fully convinced, on the other hand, that he polemicizes against it and says that it's a bad thing. I mean, you don't have to follow this argument to kind of fully accept that. I mean, letter 14 is quite clear that he rejects all these people, he anathematizes them. So I don't see any conflict, I guess, whatsoever in holding a position that Jacob uses Antiochian biblical exegesis, it informs his work, and he polemicizes against it, regardless of what you're doing with anti-Judaism. For me, that's kind of a fact on the ground. I mean, it's a very interesting question, but it doesn't in any way kind of undermine what's going on with the anti-Judaism here. So I don't follow you there at all, I have to say. And then to your, I think the first point, I mean, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question about this project. I think you rightly say that I would change Jacob from someone who doesn't ever name or talk about or polemicize against his Christological opponents into someone who does in basically every homily. And yes, that is the implications of the argument. That's exactly what I'm arguing. So I mean, yeah, it's I don't know what to I don't exactly see kind of what the problem with doing it. I mean, he uses new Jews. We know he's doing this already. It's clear that he maps. So I mean, that's established from the homily on the Council of Chalcedon, his most explicit homily. And then in these other homilies, he's polemicizing against the Jews. So yeah, that is the argument, if correctly understood. Thanks, David.
Thank you, David. Two more questions. We're running out of time. These are the last two questions, Aaron. One was typed in chat. It says, did you mean that Jacob of Serugh was persecuting Jews who showed all love and care for Christ and his church since his crucifixion, death, and resurrection? What was the behavior and teachings of the Jews about Christ and church? What Jewish behavior of thinking caused Jacob to react?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, my response is that when we have Jacob, there's no doubt that Jacob has anti-Jewish polemic throughout his homilies, that anti-Judaism is prevalent in his works. And I just want to suggest that we should pause and think about what this is doing as rhetoric, to take it seriously as literature and as rhetoric, and to think about. So I don't think we should jump from the fact that he has anti-Jewish polemic to that he's persecuting Jews. I think that that's a problematic jump. And then the question is, how far do we take this kind of rhetorical interpretation? That is, maybe he's constructing a Jew to polemicize against real Jews, or maybe he's constructing a Jew to polemicize even, against not Jews, but against Christians. So yeah, I don't think that there's much evidence that Jacob was persecuting Jews. Although, again, there's no doubt that his anti-Judaism has huge ramifications, problematically so, for real Jews.
Last question, Bob?
Thank you. Armando, and thank you, Kelly and Robert, for preparing this talk. Thank you so much. I found this talk very interesting. Can you hear me, or should I go off video?
It's better now that your video is
you
off.
can hear me
you
better.
Yeah.
My question is, when I was in seminary, the seven menera against the Jews, homilies contra la Juifs, by Micheline Albert, and I believe most of the translations were done by Professor Antoine Guillemont, and that was in 1976, 45 years ago. The present thinking, the thinking on that then was these memoirs were anti-Semitic. But now we're not so sure. What has changed? Is there specific Syriac words that Professors Guillemont and Albert translated differently? What about the tone of the translations? Were they biased? There's been some question that Professors Albert and Guillemont were biased themselves. You covered very expertly the area of that many people did not have a complete understanding of context. Again, thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's a good way to kind of, sum up. So, I mean, yes, those specific homilies that you mentioned are certainly anti-Jewish. They're a problematic representation of anti-Judaism in Syriac literature and in Jacob of Serugh. So, I mean, there's no doubt about that. The question is, how do we as scholars, as historians, as people interested in historic theology, how do we kind of deal with this? And who is this polemic addressed against? So my first proposal in doing, if one comes to such a text, is to step back and say, do we have real Jews or imagined Jews here? Who are these people in this text? Is this author constructing them, or do we actually think that there's a Jewish community that they're representing to some degree? It can be both and if you end up in an imagined category, then you have to step back and think, well, what's the point of this rhetoric? What is the goal of it? What's the purpose of it? Who's it targeting? Who's the audience? How's the audience supposed to respond? And in that way, I think that there are questions on those homilies in particular, but in anti-Jewish literature more broadly, including in Jacob of Serugh, about whether this is directed against, some group of Jews that's living next door to Jacob's church. And I think that we should stop and think about if that's really what we think is going on. Historically, that's how people have interpreted it. Again, you can go back to Marcel Simon's 48 book, I believe it was. But there's been a lot of questions raised because we know of a number of cases where this can't be true. Right, so Jacob himself says something like new Jews who arose at Chalcedon. So there we know that there's not Jews. Or this letter to the Emperor Marcion, where Jews write to Marcion and say, can we reopen our synagogues now? Because Chalcedon decreed that God wasn't crucified, but just a human. Again, I've given versions of this type of material a lot of places, and some people want to continue to maintain that it was some group of Jews in Jerusalem who wrote this letter. I just don't see it. I don't see how it's at all possible. It seems that this is clearly an imagined Jew. That is, this is a group of Miaphysite Christians writing a polemical letter to cast dispersions on the Council of Chalcedon. That's all it is. And it's a very interesting attempt. But so when you have these types of things, the question becomes, when you have an anti-Jewish treatise like Jacob of Serugh, what do we do with it? And there's a world of possibilities, from this is constructed rhetoric against real Jews to constructed rhetoric against dyophysite, and probably many other things. And that's what I would really like to kind of get across in this lecture. So thanks for your question, and thank everyone for their time and attention.
Thank you, Aaron. That was wonderful. Before we adjourn, I'd like to remind you that our next speaker is Thomas Kulamparampil. He will deliver his paper, Pastoral Catechesis of Mar Jacob of Serugh, on Wednesday, October 20th, 2021. I would like to remind you also of the symposium in commemoration of the 15th centenary of St. Jacob of Serugh's death, Saturday, December 4th, 2021. The symposium starts at 9:15 a.m. and ends with a banquet at 7 p.m. I'm uploading the program of the symposium. For some reason, it's not working. Okay. It's not working. I apologize for that. Thank you, Aaron, Kelly, James, and all of you who join us on Zoom, on YouTube, or on Facebook. We will see you all. We will see all of you next week, next time in October. Have a wonderful day.